Alrighty, everybody, welcome back for Unit 3. Here we're starting to look at the supply and demand model, long-run aggregate supply, and fiscal policy. So just to kind of hit some of the highlights again, if we're looking at changes in an economy, it can be represented on a graph using, if we're looking at the entire economy, we're using aggregate demand and aggregate supply here. That word aggregate just meaning total, and we're looking at the supply both in the short run and the long run. The short run is looking at, now, if we can't change variables. The long run, given enough of time, if we can change variables, what our economy is capable of. So an economy can either have a negative output gap where they're underproducing, we also call it a recessionary gap, or a positive output gap, which we call an inflationary gap where we're overproducing. And full employment is whenever we're at that natural rate of unemployment, that sustainable long-term growth. So an initial change in spending is amplified in the economy due to the multiplier effect. So remember that every person has this kind of inclination to either save or spend money, right? You're given $1,000, maybe you save half and spend half. Well, that money is going to circulate a couple times throughout the economy. The amount of the change depends on how much people spend, which is their marginal propensity to consume. So let's remember our MPC, the marginal propensity to consume. Give me one moment, I got to pause it real quick. You grab it for me? That'd be great. The MPC, marginal propensity to consume, given additional money, what's the propensity or likelihood that you use that money to spend on something? The flip side of that would be the marginal propensity to save. Hey, how's it going? Were you the one that you went to grab something from another teacher? All right, cool. All right. An unhealthy economy will eventually self-correct without any government intervention, because if we're in that inflationary gap, wages go up, resource prices go up, making it more difficult to supply goods. If we're in a recessionary gap, people are willing to get paid less, resource prices get lower, and that increases our supply of goods. So wages and resource prices are flexible in the long run, but they're not in the short run. So the government uses fiscal policy, which is looking at changes in spending and taxes to either speed up or slow down our economy. If we're looking at the pandemic with both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, you see two sides of the same coin, right? Donald Trump passed a pretty big tax cut bill, which is designed to expand our economy. Joe Biden passed the stimulus checks, which were designed to do the same thing. Whoever's got music going, let's pause it. All right, on to aggregate demand. If we're looking at the difference between a market demand curve, like a normal demand curve, and the aggregate demand, market demand is looking at one specific product, so the market demand for houses or the market demand for burgers. Aggregate demand is just looking at everything, every good and service in our economy. So houses, haircuts, cars, whatever, everything within our economy. That word aggregate just means total. We're looking at all of it together in aggregate. All right, and if we're looking at why our aggregate demand curve, it looks like our normal demand curve, downward sloping, of why it's downward sloping. It's for these three big reasons. This wealth effect is looking at the fact that if prices are higher, these goods eat up a bigger chunk of our wealth. So we've got price and quantity. If prices are higher, it eats up a bigger chunk of our wealth. If the prices are cheap, it doesn't really impact our wealth that much, right? The second big factor is interest rates. So this interest rate effect, the idea is that if price levels are higher, banks are going to have to charge higher interest rates in order to get a real return on their investments. So if price levels go up, interest rates are going to go up as well. That makes it more difficult to afford goods. Our demand would be lower. Quantity demand would be lower. And again, we don't need to be talking right now. I'm recording some video lessons, so let's just hold off on that for about 10 minutes. And then the last part would be foreign trade. So if, let's say, the US dollar depreciates and our goods are worth less, all right, that would make the demand for our goods increase. But vice versa, the US dollar is really strong, the price level's high, the demand for our goods are going to be low. And if we're looking at what can shift our aggregate demand here, it's anything that's going to affect spending. So changes in consumer spending, changes in government spending, changes in business investments, and changes in net exports. And if this looks familiar, it's because that's our GDP, all the spending in our economy. Consumer spending, government spending, business investments, exports. That our GDP is our aggregate demand. It's all of the goods produced and consumed in our society. If we're looking at the supply side of things, explain the difference between the short run and the long run. In the short run, variables can't change. All right, ladies, we don't need to be talking right now. And whoever's got the music going, let's pause it. All right, so yeah, in the short run, variables can't change, right? So if we're looking at a business, employers aren't willing to change their workers' wages very easily. You know, they can only produce a certain amount in the short run. The long run, we're assuming that all variables can change, right? We can raise or lower wages, we can raise or lower resource prices. So if we're looking at, let's say, demand going up in the short run, we're getting close to Christmas. Prices of goods might go up, quantity of goods increase. In the long run, though, we're going to be back to equilibrium, right? Because our factories can only produce so much, our workers can only produce so much. In the short run, maybe they can overproduce, but if they do that, it's going to lead to higher prices in the long run. So if we're looking at why the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, it's because as prices go up, quantity supplied goes up as well. Businesses are willing to produce more goods at a higher price. If we're looking at the shifters in the short run, we use this acronym RAP. So we're looking at resource prices. If the price of oil goes up, that's going to affect the price of everything else, right? The shirt that you're wearing, the bag of lettuce that you buy, all of those are used, use oil to be shipped. So if the price of that goes up, your goods get more expensive. If the price goes down, your goods get cheaper. The actions by the government. So that could be like your subsidies, your taxes, different kinds of regulations will increase or decrease the supply of goods. So like let's say that the government passed a new regulation saying that a worker needs a break every 2 hours, right? In theory, that would probably decrease our aggregate supply. We're able to produce less because now workers have to take more breaks. And then the P would be the productivity, right? If we find new ways of doing things like Henry Ford and the assembly line, right, that's going to increase our productivity across the board with everything we produce. Now, if we're looking at our multipliers here, the multiplier effect is looking at how this initial change in spending is going to kind of compound throughout the economy, right? We spend $100 at the grocery store. That person gets, the owner of the grocery store gets $100. They keep, let's say, 20%, and they go and spend the other $80. That money's going to keep circulating throughout the economy. So our MPC, this marginal propensity to consume, is given new income, the percentage of it that you will spend. So if I'm given $1,000 and I spend 500 of that, my MPC would be 0.5 or 50%. I'd be spending with 50% of new income. The MPS, the marginal propensity to save, is given new income, the percentage of it you would save. Right? So if I'm given $1,000 and I spend 800 and I save 200, my MPC would be 0.8, my MPS would be 0.2, right? And they're always going to equal to 1, right? Because given additional money, you can do one of these two things, whether you could spend it or you could save it. What is the equation for the spending multiplier? We do 1 over MPS. So what we see here is that the lower this MPS is, the less people save, the more that money is going to circulate throughout the economy. The higher that MPS is, the more they save, the lower that spending multiplier is. And our equation for the tax multiplier is MPC over MPS. The marginal propensity to consume over the marginal propensity to save. So if the government increases spending, that's going to have a bigger impact on our economy than if the government cuts taxes. Because if the government increases spending, part of our GDP is government spending, right? Consumer spending, government spending, business investments. So if the government increases spending, well, GDP goes up. But if the government cuts taxes, or if we have like distribution programs or transfer payments like welfare or food stamps or Social Security, that isn't going to immediately impact GDP. Now it will eventually, because people are going to keep a percentage of that money and then they're going to spend the rest of it. But that tax multiplier, it's always going to end up being it's always going to end up being 1 less than the spending multiplier. So just to take a look at some of these true and false statements down here, the MPC plus the MPS equals 0.1. So that's true, because it's a percentage, right? If I spend 50% and I save 50%, that equals 100% or 1. If I consume with 60%, then that means that I am saving 40%. It's always going to equal out to 1. The spending multiplier increases when MPC increases. So that would be true. So if people are spending more money, then that money is going to multiply throughout the economy more times. So let's look at it this way. So assume that my MPC is 0.5, my MPS is also going to be 0.5. So that multiplier, and who was the pass to?
Oh, Miss B.
To Miss D? There you go. So if I'm saving half in MPS, MPC, and I'm spending the other half, 1 over 0.5, my spending multiplier is 2. But if that MPC goes up, let's say my MPC becomes 0.8, my MPS is going to be 0.2. 1 divided by 0.2 is 5. So if I am spending more, that multiplier gets higher. A $10 billion increase in government spending will result in the same total change as a $10 billion tax cut. Like I was saying, that one would be false, right? The spending multiplier is always going to be larger than the tax multiplier because it has an immediate effect on our economy. If the government raises spending by $10 billion and cuts taxes by $10 billion, that's going to have a bigger effect than if the government cuts $10 billion worth of taxes. Transfer payments don't get multiplied since they don't count on GDP. That would be false. We just use that tax multiplier, the MPC over the MPS. All right, let's do a couple of practice ones there. I'm not going to do all of them because it's pretty much the same math over and over again, but what we need to figure out that it's not really giving us is what our multiplier is going to be. And it might be the spending multiplier, and it might be the tax multiplier. But either way, we're going to need to kind of figure it out. All right, the other important formula we need here is that total change formula. Total change equals the initial change times the multiplier. So here we're given pieces of the information. We know that the total change is $60 billion. We know that the initial change is $30 billion. So then the multiplier is going to need to be 2. If I'm trying to figure out what the multiplier is, here it's having me kind of figure out what the MPC is. We know that 1 over MPS, my multiplier based on what we looked at here is going to need to be 2. All right, divide this side by 2, this side by 2. 1 divided by 2 would be 0.5. So if my MPS is 0.5, that means that my MPC is going to be 0.5 as well. All right, let's look at this second one. So we have our total change. I'll do the math up over here. The total change, $200 billion. The initial change times the multiplier. All right, so if my MPC is 0.1, my MPS is going to be 0.1. Or if my MPC is 0.9, my MPS is going to be 0.1. 1 divided by 0.1 is 10. So we don't have the initial change, but we do have the multiplier. It's 10. 20 billion divided by 10 would be, 200 billion divided by 10 would be $20 billion. So an initial change of $20 billion, it's going to multiply throughout the economy 10 times because the MPC is 0.9, so the MPS is 0.1. It's going to have a total effect on the economy by $20 billion. And then we'll do this last one because it's a tax one instead of a spending one. Let's remember that our tax multiplier is different. If our MPC is 0.8, okay, so MPC is 0.8, so our MPS is going to be 0.2. Our formula for the tax multiplier is MPC over MPS. 0.8 divided by 0.2 is going to be 4. So we know that our multiplier is going to be 4. The initial change is $10 billion. The multiplier is going to be 4. Total change to the economy is going to be $40 billion. Let me double check that's right real quick. You'll know I'm not the best with math. Yep, looks good. Alright, and we'll leave it off on that one. The rest, just use the same math. The tax, or spending multiplier, 1 over MPS, tax multiplier, MPC over MPS. I will pause it here.